the director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women across the street at Barnard College. And I do have a couple of moments of business to get out of the way before we get started on our conversation. And we really do want to structure this as a conversation. This is not a panel or a back and forth. Dorian and I have been talking over the past 2 days about how we can best get a conversation going in a room this big. So that's going to be our hope, along with Urvashi and Dean. So my first order of business is some thank yous. There are some particular people we have to thank. First of all, of course, my co-organizers, Urvashi Vod and Dean Spade. Students and volunteers who work the conference, the facility staff at both Columbia Law School and Barnard College, and then two people in particular that I think deserve our special thanks, who are Cindy Gao and Ann Jonas, who've done all the logistical work. So a couple of announcements. I've been asked to announce that directly after this session, a bunch of people are going to Sweet, which is a bar on 109th and Amsterdam. Remember when we used to just have this in the bar? But on 109th and Amsterdam. So anyone is welcome to join us, your friends, and anybody else that you want to bring along. So if you're interested, we can continue the conversation there. And a couple of other announcements. Let's see, Andy, you had an announcement?
People would be willing, if you have an organization that would be willing to sign on in support of Marissa Alexander. As I mentioned earlier, there's the issue that the anti-violence programs were threatened with defunding if they supported her, so it's important to have other organizations to make up for that support. So I just have a makeshift sheet. So we need specifically, the campaign specifically needs organizational group support. So if you have it, you could do it now if you could sign on, or if not, you need to bring it back to your group. I have my email address here and also the website for the campaign. So I'll just pass that around and just get that to me. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. All right, any other announcements, any other business that we have to cover here? This is our last chance. No, good. All right. So we do want to make this a conversational session, and so when we were thinking of this initially, and then what we asked Dorian to participate in was some kind of conference summary, some kind of final conversation, and so we were asked to, both Dorian and I were asked to pull out themes over the course of the 2 days, and so we've done that, and we have a couple to share with you. But we want to know two things from all of you, which is, one, what were the key themes that you saw, and how would you articulate them and draw them out? And then we hope to get some threads of conversation going about those. And two, what hasn't been covered at this conference. We found out in the last plenary that we're going to have the ending capitalism. Now that we've ended the nonprofit industrial complex, we're moving on to capitalism. So, conference next, so look for that. Sign up on the Barnard Center for Research on Women website. We'll have that next year. But what wasn't covered? So what we're going to do is give you all, because it's hard to get a conversation going with this many people, a chance to talk in dyads or small groups, however you want to organize yourselves. Some of this came out of a conversation last night at the reception with Catherine and JD. So, and then we will have a chance to pull out some of those themes and do the low-tech thing of putting them on the chalkboard, and then we'll get some conversation going about all of those. So, does that sound like a good way to proceed? That's what we're thinking we're going to do. Good. So I think Dorian now is going to introduce himself and pull out his key themes, and then I'll throw in a couple of mine, and then we'll turn it over to the dyads.
Hey, everybody.
Hi.
Do we need to stretch? Are we good? We have enough energy to get us to Sweet? Great. Okay. So I'm Dorian Warren. I teach political science and public affairs here at Columbia. I wear a number of hats. I'm a teacher. I'm also on several boards of organizations, mostly in the community organizing world. I spend most of my time hanging out with the labor movement. couldn't be a much more depressing and boring group of folks to be around. If you think of the labor, I hang around a movement where they self-consciously say all the time how much they're dying. So that's where I spend my time. So I want to first thank all of you for being fun and joyful and passionate and funny the last 2 days. It's been a real joy to be here. So I have about 3 or 4 themes just to get us started, and then obviously if we're gonna miss some things or you'll react to them. So the one theme I want to pull out obviously is the hand-wringing the last 2 days on the relationship between organizations and fundraising. And there's a lot of anxiety in all the rooms, a lot of hand-wringing, this dilemma of resources and funding. What's the relationship between your organization and government funding or donors or foundations? And so I found this interesting because when you think about the labor movement, for instance, it's entirely self-funded. They don't ask for resources from anybody, most unions, yet they're the most conservative organizations on the left, arguably. So it's perplexing me why, on some level, everyone's so worried about this relationship between philanthropy in particular and your organizational goals and missions. If you think about what happened earlier today, there was this march on the Brooklyn Bridge of the immigrant rights movement. Almost entirely foundation, dependent, yet not necessarily constraining their goals or tactics in the same way. So I want us to not hand-wring so much. These are the right questions. There is an inherent tension. It's inevitable. There has not been a movement I'm aware of that hasn't had some philanthropic support on the left in American history. So this is an inherent condition that we all face. But I think we can lighten up a little bit too. So that's the first comment. Another comment on fundraising, and this is something that I think about because I am a funder sometimes. I serve on this small foundation called the Discount Foundation, and we fund organizations that are involved in low-wage worker organizing. And so there was a conversation yesterday in one of the sessions about the hoops that we all have to jump through when writing a grant, or especially the evaluation hoops when we have to report out to funders what we've been doing with their money, I should say. And it occurred to me that on some level, there's a flip side. Those are all the right questions. There's a flip side to that funder-organizational relationship, and that is we're not very good at holding ourselves accountable. And sometimes, and let's be real, a lot of us do shitty work in the field, and we don't like to call each other out. And sometimes there's that accountability to funders helps give us some metrics on how are we measuring up to our own goals and organizational mission. Again, I'm not saying this is the norm, but I think it raised the question, what mechanisms of accountability are in place in our organizations and as a field to call the question on, are we doing good work? Are we upholding the organizational mission? Are we empowering the people who we claim to represent and be empowering? A second theme had to do with organizational structure and culture. And I think there's a tension here between what kind of organizational forms ultimately support a transformational politics and not a transactional politics. And obviously that was resolved yesterday. I do think there is this, again, it's an inevitable tension, especially in a context of the professionalization of the nonprofit industrial complex, where you have professional staff with their own interests, which are often different from, if it's a membership organization, the interests of the members. The interest of the staff is to keep the organization going. The interest of the members is something else. It's empowerment, it's winning on some policies, whatever it is. So that, again, I just want to suggest this is kind of the iron law of oligarchy when it comes to organizational growth and maintenance. There is a natural tendency of organizations that become professionalized to become more conservative. And I just want to suggest this is a tension not only facing LGBT organizations, but across the left social justice sphere, we all face this same tension. This is related to several people when it came to talking about philanthropy and organizations. There's a lot of discussion about inclusion and making sure diversity as a principle was actually real. And I just want to remind us to be careful to make the distinction between inclusion that's transformative and inclusion that's tokenism. And we have to think really hard about that question to ensure we have the right organizational culture and structures so that inclusion becomes transformational. The last thing I'll say, and then I'm going to shut up. There were two things that didn't really come up explicitly, but were always in the room. And the first was the role of emotion in organizations and organizational work. Whether it's, and it came up a little bit here yesterday around anger, around race, and lack of representation. It came up around, we can talk about love or desire or passion or joy or grief. Grief came up a little bit, but I want us to be much more explicit about thinking through what's the role of emotion in the work that we do. And then there was a second implicit question that was right below the surface, and this was a question about scale. In terms of, if we're doing movement building, how do we get to scale to be able to be as powerful to end capitalism for structural change? But keeping in mind the tensions, right, of needing resources, of being overly professionalized, of the conservative nature of organizations as they get larger. So how do we deal with that question of scale, of having enough power, whether if we're doing base building, having enough power among our members to actually win structural changes, versus the inherent tension towards conservatism within our own organizations. So I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you, Dorian. And there are just two things that I want to put on the table, and then we'll turn it over to the dyads. And the first one, because I haven't fully got articulated, it came up some in this last session, but one, we divided up the sessions, and I went to abolishing the nonprofit industrial complex, and it goes along with the first one that Dorian raised, which is how we think about money. And part of that conversation, as I understood it, and those of you who were in that conversation can correct me, was that there was some conversation about, are we trying to think about whether some money is cleaner than other money, or is all money just dirty? And the other thing we were talking about in that conversation is how do we make a larger framework for our work, so that it's not just what do I do my individual choices, but putting the work of any organization or person in a larger movement. And the thing that came to my mind is that throughout the course of 2 days, there has been a lot of talk that has seemed to come from a moral framework around the question of money. And in that last session, Yasmin Nair was talking about, I feel as though I'm sometimes asked to take a vow of poverty, which is in a religious framework of morality around sin, for example. And I would suggest that that's not the right framework, that money is a problem for us, not just because of capitalism, but also because of the law. The law exists to protect private property, and we have a whole critique of criminalization, and yet we talk about money as if it is not the case, that what the law does is pretend it sets up the myth that some money is clean. And basically, if you have money, you took it from someone. That you didn't earn it, you took it from someone, and it sets up, to my mind, and I work at one of these kinds of institutions, the idea that maybe we should think more actively about taking money. And so that part of what we have to think about is not, are we getting money from the right place? I think the constraint question is an important one, but also actively, how are we thinking about what it is that we do around the question of not just following rules. And this goes around money. And this goes to a second question that has come up for me, which is about what does it mean that we are queer dreams in nonprofit blues, dilemmas of the nonprofit tradition in LGBT politics. And the second real tension that came up for me was around, in several of the conversations I was in, and I also facilitated some conversations amongst the panels in preparation for the last 2 days, is about, well, should we be naming things as specifically LGBT, or does that in fact narrow the focus or create a politics of inclusion that's tokenism, or does it have effects that we don't want, or Trishal Devitt was talking earlier today about what's the relationship between a movement to end poverty or Andy to end capitalism and the question of LGBT politics. And then my question about, and what is the queer specific contribution, which we haven't talked about a lot in the last 2 days, because to my mind, when I was brought into the movement, it meant don't follow rules, you know, be bad in whatever ways you want to, be sexy in whatever ways you want to, you know, and those things have not traveled around this conference in the same way. So I felt both overly constrained by the LGBTQ and not enough of a sense of a sense of a sort of sexy badness. Those are the things that we talked about, yeah, Ursula, your point?
Oh, I was saying, thank you. And I remember that we had invited moderators from the different sessions.
Yes, and I talked to a couple of those moderators. So for those of you who are prepared to talk as moderators, we thought that we'd do the dyads and then the moderators will have the chance to come in. Yeah, thank you, Ursula. All right, so here's the thing. 2 people, more people, as many people as you want. If you brought your pets, include them. We'll give you, what, 10 minutes?
So now is your chance to share with the group as a whole things that you would like to have as potential threads of discussion and issues to raise and things that you want to talk about at Sweet or for the rest of your life. We could also have a category called Never Again. So we'll do this for about 10, maybe 15 minutes, and then that will give us time for 15 minutes to have a couple of threads for more in-depth conversation. Okay? Good. All the way in the back and then all the way in the front. And we're going to write on the board, and forgive my handwriting, I flunked it when I was 6.
So one thing that has come up a lot but hasn't really been discussed is the relationship between the organizers and the members, and people make this distinction very casually, and there's like not very much discussion around it. And a couple other things we thought about that like haven't been addressed is like the issue of like stealing and as a possibility as a way of like getting money somehow.
So should I put a slash from I'm not
So I think for me a theme is like learning to hold complexity more, because we haven't met Compa, but it felt like some of the ways you all even were talking about the themes felt a little bit like simplistic, like, oh, it's either we don't take any money or we take all the money, or it's either like we don't worry about how fucked up nonprofits are or we love it. You know what I mean? Like, how do we hold more complexity, knowing, where we're at, but also being able to know, like, what's our vision? Which, I don't know if the sister who was here earlier, Marla?
Oh, Mara, you mean on the panel?
Yes.
Mara, yeah.
Who said we're not going to end capitalism. I completely disagree with her. And I think that if we are here, it's because at some level we believe that we are going to end capitalism at some point. And that's right, that's why it's queer dreams and nonprofit groups, right? Yes, beautiful, thank you. So yeah, just being able to figure out like what are the strategies to build movements and like having jobs and like what are strategic positionalities or decisions that we're making instead of just like simplistically putting things in opposite poles.
All the way back, Ellen, and then down.
All right, help me out. So we took Dorian to the Word and we talked about emotion. And the first thing that we felt as a group was that, and this happens all the time, and some of it is just structural, that we were all hungry for some more depth. That the conversations happened here, and we were hungry for, happened at the Leaves, and we were hungry for some roots. The other thing that somebody in our group brought up was that there's another conference going on around African American incarceration. Is that?
Yep.
And that people haven't been forced to choose conferences. And that's a problem that we've had for a long time. So we should pay attention to those things. Then we talked about how to connect maybe the panels to the plenaries. So the plenaries were dynamic, fabulous, fantastic, and that it would have been really great if we had connected and gotten to more of an implementation place, had we been able to make a better connection from the plenaries to the panels, and that we were thankful to finally have an intergenerational conversation. Hello?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, so me and Lily were discussing how, I mean, maybe it was a panel I happened to go to, but this conversation was extremely, for the entire conference was extremely American-centric, and I feel like we really need to look at the transnational perspective and how Lily was commenting on how she's working in Mexico, and the organizational kind of makeup of those organizations, sorry, to be redundant, was extremely different. So I think a transnational perspective to bring in would be really wonderful. And then also kind of the indigenous groups kind of recognize where their land history is and kind of building up organizations with that. And then for me, I was at the LGBTQ anti-violence work and movement infrastructure workshop panel, and it was really great, but I was wondering where all the gay men voices were, because for me it was a lot of lesbians talking about work with women, and the thing is violence isn't just for women, and sexual violence or abuse or various other like hate violence, it isn't just against lesbians or women, it's gay men too. So I just would love to hear the gay men talk about that. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
All the way back. Yes.
Great. So one thing we talked about, is it working?
Yeah.
Is complicity. And where do we go from there? Once we identified who was complicit, who isn't, one thing we talked about was this is a complex, this is a system, this is a political economy, this is something we're all in. And whether we are trying to work outside of it or trying to work beyond it, we are in it and affected by it at the very least. So once we identify that complicity, the things that we're perpetuating, the things that we're reproducing, well, what do we do with that? Do we hand out blame and kind of reproduce these neoliberal ideologies about individual accountability by blaming individuals for being part of a complex or not being part of a complex? Or what do we do instead of that? And so I'm struggling to figure out, once we identify complicity, what do we do with that complicity? How do we mobilize, not in spite of that complicity, but I guess, yeah, what do we do with that?
One thing that only came up explicitly in one of the panels that I was in for this conference was the role of the university in the non-public industrial complex. As a site where students not only incur a lot of students incur so much debt that will maybe pressure them to professionalize their activist actions, but also as a place that can co-opt radical language. So, with the maybe or maybe not all the student debt will actually end up being paid off, but I don't know. I think it's a huge part of it.
Yeah, good. All right, someone around here.
So one of the issues I've been thinking about a lot is around, when we talked a bit about this, is white supremacy, and kind of as a white person for me to say the non-profit industrial complex is dead. And I think there might have been an article about this, what it means at a time that more people of color are getting jobs in the non-profit industrial complex, as problematic as it is. I've done my 8-year stint and I now have a mortgage. So opening up those spaces so people of color can also have access to land and resources that have been historically denied to them. So that's kind of a critical issue for me, is the role of white people in this and stepping back, and where that discourse comes from people of color. And second Northeast and the West, and where we also are in a place where in the South there's so little funding that this would be a very different dialogue.
I was wondering if the focus on one industrial complex at a time tends to make us focus on our angst about that industrial complex because there's some other place where we're not going to be in one. And instead, maybe where we start is how we're going to build mass movements for then global oppression. So we think about it in mass movements, and we will be strategic in any different kind of place we're at. But it gets us less out of the angst mode and more of the how we're going to mobilize, what resources do we need, how we're going to get it. And the sky's kind of open on what we can do to go forward.
I apologize because this is tangentially related, but I'd like to take this opportunity while we're discussing all these very critical things to say that over the past few days, I've heard and experienced in panels and just in general conversation, very uncomfortable, casual, ableist language. And so I would like to take this opportunity to remind myself and to encourage all of us as students and as activists and community members to hold that with us and be mindful of how our words and our language and how we use them impacts other people around us and how it impacts us different.
Other dyads here. I don't know what the word for four, so we were two triads.
A four-way.
We began our four-way by looking to see how few white hairs were in the room, and trying to think through why that is. And we came up with a few things. Some was about just economics, around who can afford to be here, also around who is living, who's not living, who's still active in doing the work, and who knew about this event. We talked about the importance of a living wage within this world that we're talking about. And that was something related to longevity. You know, we heard a story about kind of being shunned for wanting to make a living wage and wanting to think about, you know, having the things, having money so they could have a family and have a home and stuff like that. Also talking about interdependence, you know, just very broadly. And then we touched on a little bit around, we want to keep exploring the role of culture in this conversation and fighting for it as an important strategy. And I guess, like, to be personal is, like, if we have to use art and culture, and I emphasis on the word use, I want to use it for us as a form of soul repair, as a form of info sharing, as a means of gathering, as a form of diversifying our roles, and a means of not being so same, and as a place for emotions.
Okay, so let's talk about just a couple things that are six-way. Talk about a couple things that I just really talk about with my cat. So one is, so we talked about like who is, this idea of like who is and is not deserving of funding, of like relationship building, of, you know, whatever. And this competition versus collaboration thing. The access around this conference, for example, so some of this stuff was named, but I think one of the advantages of having, I'm like creeped out about being in the Columbia camp, like this is weird. Right around Indigenous Peoples Day, but anyway. So, and in general, but I think that one of the things about like having a free conference, I think that's great, and then also, you know, we have the opportunity for like language access, like we have, you know, like ASL interpretation, like multilingual communication that is not here. You know, and in terms of like wheelchair access, that kind of stuff, like I'm part of like grassroots networks of like sick and disabled queers, you know, and I'm not seeing it, you know, like there's just like a lot that's, you know, interesting around this, and a lot of the folks who are queer and trans people of color who are low or no income, who have been working around issues in the nonprofit industrial complex, who are not at this conference, who are not asked to participate. So I'm curious about that. The not saying that there's anything like malicious or whatever, it's just, you know, some of these things as they happen. So also, I didn't hear too much this weekend about models that have existed in our communities and in our bones for generations. And like some of those things that are maybe they happen, because I know I got here late. And we're right on time. So practice, and then also like practice, like, so there have been a lot of these like panels and like, you know, this is a little bit of like dialogue and stuff, but I think I'm interested in like practice, actual like somatic practice, like releasing nonprofit hegemony, whatever, from our minds and bodies, like making ritual together, practicing communication differently, you know, that kind of stuff, because like that actually, that helps me, you know, coming next weekend, other than just living in my head. And then another piece around I want to push back around this piece around mass movements. So I think I'm excited about like mass movement building in combination with network building. So like the like emergent strategy stuff, the things that Adrian Murray Brown and the Allied Media Conference, the principles that Media Conference is built around shit that happens organically in the networks that we're already part of. So,
I think that our group, Triad, was wanting more depth too, and maybe more like theoretical or intellectual depth, not a kind of narrow academic production, but realizing that there's long-standing historical discussions and quite relevant texts that are produced by organic intellectuals from social movements all over the world, and that we should have more erotic engagement or re-engagement with these traditions. And so we might realize we had like 3 or 4 different conversations going on at once. Like, what's our conversation about the state? You know, are we social democrats, so we want to preserve the welfare state, so we get more services? Marxists want to take over the state with a dictatorship of the proletariat, which didn't work too well, to have the state wither, or anarchists think the state is just inherently corrupt, you know, like, are we located in any of those, or do we engage those traditions with a clarified directions? When we think about strategy, we have to strategize not just about our organizations or about a campaign, but like what's happening globally with capital, and how do we understand that in this current mode of production, and how do we intervene with it? So more of those kinds of discussions, I think, could deepen our discussions and also make us aware of like when we're having the same conversation on this.
Great. One of the things we discussed in our four-way is was that it was fantastic that we were aware in many of our spaces of the people who were not here because of barriers or for resources or whatever. But on the other end of the spectrum, we're also aware that there were many folks from the mainstream movement or from folks that come from communities of privilege, to have them either, if it would be valuable to have them in the space, but having a conversation about how to get our messages and our conversation to the folks that are making a lot of these fun decisions and the direction of the mainstream movement. The value in being able to either have them in this space or just engage them, or have the tool, or discuss in this space the tools to translate into you know, the mainstream language, the importance of addressing all the issues we discussed.
I'm actually going to just like really brief. I would have liked to have seen perhaps a more concrete conversation where we, you know, for folks who are interested in actually demolishing the nonprofit industrial complex, having a nuts and bolts conversation about how we could get together as a collective. You know, for instance, we have something like, I mean, and not to say this is a perfect model, but we have something like political resistance to talk about or engage, you know, this notion of demolishing the prison industrial complex. To what extent do we have something similar with the nonprofit industrial complex? I think there's a lot of folks within the NPIC who are talking about these things, but we're not sort of in a position of actually doing something like that. So having that sort of as an available option, I think would be great.
Dean, do you want to?
One thought that really reminded me of something I was thinking about in the last panel that we were in together. So I feel like one conversation that I think we could deeper here that I heard a bit is this question about people's immediate needs, and like one of the one of the big critiques I think a lot of people have about the mainstream LGBT thing is that it doesn't meet people's immediate needs, so it's primarily focused on like changing what the laws say about us, but doesn't do much in terms of like what people live on the ground. Like the person from Vermont who was talking earlier today about how like they can't get funded to do this work on the ground supporting youth because the state supposedly has all the problems solved because it's got like the right gay policies on top, you know? like that dilemma and how a lot of us have experienced like being told by LGBT foundations that they don't want to fund service work because they don't see that as like as important, right? But that's where a lot of us like poverty work. So that dilemma, and I think that's an interesting tension. So if we recognize that like these sort of the NPIC LGBT strategies have not met our immediate needs, and also that existing social services don't actually meet the needs of poor people and are really like racist and ableist and fucked up, then how do we think about how we would meet immediate needs in the world we're trying to build, and like what does that have or not have to do with various organizational structures that we've been talking about? And I think something that Erica Miners brought up in the last session that I was in that was really useful to me, that I think is a broader framework I would like to all to be using, is thinking about how prison abolition work is confronting these exact same questions. So the questions about how we can be inside systems and also support people facing the worst dangers in them right now while trying to dismantle them, how those things aren't attention necessarily, that is the path of the work. And then also, one final thing I'll say is that people inside this conference, I've felt and talked to a lot of people who feel also like defensive and uncomfortable about this conversation on lots of sides for lots of reasons. Like there is a lot of anxiety, and that is okay and real, that we all are like, oh shit, what are we doing? Is it right? Is it wrong? Am I a good guy? Am I a bad guy? Like these are anxieties we have, and it feels like how do we learn how to see that we are in a system and that we are individuals, so our individual choices matter, but also we're in a system, and so we are moved by that system in our choice. Like, and how do we learn, so therefore be able to like receive feedback about how we're enacting the system and not be defensive, and also and give and exchange feedback. And to me, the place where that conversation is happening the most is inside prison abolition work, because that's the space where people are saying, how do we create accountability and systems of feedback and change ourselves without using a system that says some people are bad, need to be followed, need to be like exiled forever and killed. And so I just feel like I wish like every single part of this conversation as well as work to be resourced by the prison abolition conversations, because I feel like that's where I'm seeing a lot of relationships.
Yeah, good. What I'm getting a sense of is maybe a conversation of more depth will develop. So let's follow the thread for a little while here. Yes.
Yeah, just picking up from what was said back to that, kind of maybe not defining our terms enough. So I think that one thing that we have been saying here is the word we, whilst recognizing that some people are being left out of conversations or marginalized or excluded, and maybe that we need to think critically and carefully about the fact that people want to pull in different directions sometimes, and that we as people engaged or involved in NGO non-profits or academia are not all the same, and we're not all thinking the same, we don't have the same priorities. And I think this was really well expressed by Trishala earlier. I don't know if I'm saying your name right, sorry. When you're talking about the irreconcilable difference that you recognize in some people pulling towards wanting to, like identity politics and away from identity politics. So that's something that maybe we should think about more, and it's difficult, but we're not we in a way that's always easy. And he had something really good to say in our talk, so I'm going to make him speak about it.
On the spot.
Can I put that on the board? No.
I guess my observation was about, I'm very much into language and communications, right, and understanding the way we frame questions lends itself to the answers we get. And so this dissatisfaction with depth, I think, has a lot to do with the way questions have been framed. And so I think a good example is actually around fundraising. I think there's a fundamental undercurrent of a realization that fundraising is a political act, but the questions haven't been framed as such. The questions have been, what are the strategies? Where should we get money? How many dollars are the dollars clean? Are they not? I think if the questions were framed in a way that recognizes fundraising as a political act, we would call it out explicitly and get different answers. But what are the political implications of accepting money from X, Y, and Z?
I wanted to share a couple of things, but one that you reminded me of what you just said. It would be great if there was at least two universes. So in one universe, we had this gathering, and the other universe, we had this gathering upside down, which is we all got together and came up with the questions, as what we did here, instead of being presented with the questions. And a lot of us in our organizations or our movements use participatory leadership methods. That is how we give voice, for example, by even for a big group, to get the wisdom of the group if you break up different ways, but whatever. So it did feel like very academic to me, structurally academic. I was part of the HIV kind of workshop, whatever, and we talked about sex. So I throw some things out there. We talked about how as the sort of people's movement of HIV, became and for various reasons, good and bad and desired and undesired, in more of a nonprofit government framework. There was a difference in how people talked about sex or felt they could talk about sex, and they were talking about a rhetoric of risk. I did an emphasis on anal sex, and for example, in safe sex education for men. And I wrote a note that said we need a movement to bring back the long lost art of cocksucking. Although we didn't say that, so I just want to say that now. And then we also talked about there's criminalization of HIV, where people are locked up right now, are being prosecuted, or lifetime registry sex offenders. Although Women with a Vision did beat it in Louisiana for people not being put in sex offender registry for criminalization of sex work, basically, and HIV stuff. But anyway, so we talked about criminalization of HIV as a problem and something to be worked against, and then it was also brought up not just criminalization, but demonization by our own LGBT communities, and particularly gay men and other gay men, demonizing positive men. And it's like sex suicide to go online and say that you're positive, when actually if someone is positive and undetectable, that may be actually one of the safest people to have sex with, because there's honesty and probably no risk of transmission. So we started getting into it, and we also talked about how, in general, as Dina said in the opening, that the state will tolerate a certain amount of progress of the wins we've had, and those that are compatible with neoliberalism, true kind of sexual liberation and the practices and the way we talk or act or continue to talk or act as queers around sex and fucking and sex culture and all these things are things that have been part of the HIV/AIDS discussion, but are not as well countenanced, in the nonprofit structure. But that doesn't mean we can't talk about it or do it. And we've learned well enough it's not going to happen there. That doesn't mean we don't have to, that we just let it go and write it off. I think those are some of the, and that when people are asking what can we do, at the end of the panel, and one of the things was whatever our positionality is to talk about sex. Someone asked as a healthcare provider to talk about sex as a practical measure for people living with HIV, people at risk. So I think those are some of the various ways we can talk about sex.
Also, I'm from visual aids, and I put condoms in the bathrooms, and I hit on people.
So I've been sort of thinking over my head over and over again about lots of things, and sort of the panels that I went to and the plenaries, and I think that there's a couple things that I keep coming back to. One of them is sort of the NPIC is larger than just the nonprofit institution, and I feel like a lot of the conversations have been sort of, at least some of them, have been geared towards sort of like structurally reforming individual, like what's a model for particular nonprofits, how to have a less oppressive hierarchy within the nonprofit, or how to engage with your quote-unquote membership, and like reforming ideas of leadership. And I am sort of not really that interested, personally, but partially because I don't work for a nonprofit, so it sort of feels, that conversation feels sort of irrelevant to me. But also just, sort of the ways that these models at large are larger discourses that are sort of structuring our ability to imagine social change. And I've seen, this notion of leadership, for instance. I mean, to me it sounds kind of cultish, honestly. But like this notion of leadership at large, playing out sometimes in ways that are really, can be really violent. And sort of there was this question also yesterday at the plenary, sort of like, this discourse of leadership, and why is it so common in the United States that people are talking about leadership, and sort of this question that was brought up in the global panel too, of like, the NPIC is a global thing that we're framing only within the United States. and sort of like how do we take into account U.S. imperialism within this as well? Because what we in the United States do has a global impact, but also in general, people in the United States don't think about, by default, don't think about our impacts outside of the U.S. It's sort of a very common thing, and I think that I'm also thinking about the first panel I went to, the Mirroring the State, and Kehalani especially brought up this great point about sort of the discourses of the legacies of both slavery and settler colonialism in the U.S. and how these sometimes get counterposed to each other, but they're part of a larger legacy of the U.S. as a settler colony. And I think there's sort of a tension as well between the discourse of the U.S. as a settler colony and the discourse of the U.S. as a world empire. And I think that those are we need to sort of interrogate. What does it mean that the U.S. is a colony and an empire? That the U.S. has this legacy of Jim Crow and this legacy of dispossession of indigenous people at the same time that models that are developed here are exported globally, and sort of. There's a way that these, even though they're part of the same structure, they get played against each other. And I see that constantly come up in so many different ways. Anyway, sorry, I'm rambling, but.
Let's take just one or two more and then ask Urvashi and Dean if they want to wrap up in any way and say any final comments before we get to Sweet.
I just had a really interesting sort of moment earlier this morning. I was doing an interview, and I was talking about trans women here in New York City that are organizing and are talking and having a conversation after the Islam Nettles murder and everything that's gone on. And the interviewer was awesome, amazing. I enjoyed talking with her. And there was a moment that it was raised particularly about an activist organizer here in New York, and that person being on the panel, or maybe I will ask that person later. And I didn't have the heart to say, this person is actually not involved in that work, that this is not happening in a nonprofit setting, that this organizing is not being done through any kind of funding. This is just happening because that's what people do. They just get together and start working. And so this is just something that I just wanted to share, because I wasn't going to bring it up, but I mean, someone brought up Occupy Wall Street in the panel that I was on, and it was really refreshing. And I would even want to say for myself, I brought up completely doing political organizing that had nothing to do with the nonprofit structure, and felt like, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot where I was. And so the thing that I just wanted to sort of raise is because so much, and we talk about social workers and other forms of organizing, I don't want to say other forms of organizing that is happening, that is not happening in the non-profit industrial complex. So I really appreciate the visioning of there's so much else that is happening, and that's the way it always has been. This structure is what's been imposed on organizing, and not the other way around. And I didn't have the heart to say, yes, these black and brown sisters are organizing here in New York City, and they're not getting any money, and they maybe will never do that because they know better. And that is just as viable and just as important. And you know what? And they maybe even made a decision to leave us out of it for that reason. That they're not bringing, who they're bringing to the table, or frankly, the folks that are not here. They're just on the grassroots, on the down low, on the ground, doing the work, and not people that are paid and organized. So I just wanted to bring that out too, that there's so much organizing that's happening, and it doesn't look like, or it's not living in our structure. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed this conference, and then there's two things that I've been thinking about, I guess, in relation to lived experiences. And one of the things I've been thinking about is the absence of the conversation about rural queer or low-income rural queer people and their experiences and connection to liberation and to the earth and land, and their experiences of both exile and migration, and how that kind of relates to the real threat of homelessness for those communities, and how that also fits into resources being centralized in urban spaces. And then the second thing that I've been thinking about, and people have mentioned multiple times here, is the use of language at this conference being both academic, elevated, and detached from emotion, and feeling like I don't really know what to do with that sometimes, and how that can be alienating at moments, and figuring out how that relates to communities on the ground. And then thinking about, I wish that there would have been more sharing of strategies that people are using around survival. So like lived experiences of survival, and then also strategies people are using for physical, emotional, and spiritual survival in this work.
So I just wanted to follow up on what was just said, plus sort of what our group here was talking about originally, which is kind of the structure of conferences, which is knowledge is and get imparted to the masses, and then we sit here and receive it, and here we are talking back. But you know, I mean, I think that structure needs to be broken down altogether. I mean, if we're really talking about organizing and creating something outside of the box, then we need to change that. I mean, one conference we did have at UC Berkeley, I thought was a useful structure, was on the third day, instead of having people talking to other people, we had everybody talking to each other, creating, talking about, reflecting what happened, and talking about how to implement some of the ideas, and reflecting on what had happened, sort of what's going on here, but in a more structured way. That really breaks down this kind of, some people are receiving knowledge and some people are imparting knowledge. And I think that kind of reflects some of the topic that we're talking about as well around the nonprofit structure. So, and the strategy of sharing, lived experiences and inviting people to implement things into their lived experiences and moving beyond the academic discourse. So I just want to encourage that for future conferences, that the structure of how the conference itself is organized is important in changing, in making social change.
Cindy.
Hi everybody. I'm Cindy, organizers of logistics, and I just wanted to say, I don't have a good content thing, but I just want to say that I think it's important to acknowledge all of the people that were not near and that made this happen, which is like AV staff, building services, print services, like literally it was like 50 people who like had to work on a Saturday and Friday, come in at 7:30, deal with my rush orders, like all of these things. And so I think it's, like we talk about this like obviously Columbia, like crazy intense imperial bureaucracy, whatever, but it's like, there are literally like for every student there's like an administrative person, and it's like the staff here is like it's huge, and it requires so many people to make this thing happen. So
I'm glad you spoke up, because I did want to say that this has been, I think, a useful and productive conversation and critique, frankly. But we should not ignore the organizers of the conference at the same time, and the real work that went into this. So let's thank them again. Eric, Dean, want to make any last comments or send us off?
I just want to say thank you to everybody. This is great insights, great conversations. And, it's amazing to me that we sat down about 2 years ago. Dean had an idea, and it was going to be a little symposium, like, that academic people do. And then we expanded it into a conference which would focus on some dilemmas of the nonprofit tradition in LGBT politics. That was what this conference was about, some dilemmas of the nonprofit tradition in LGBT politics. And I'm really grateful to all the speakers, and that means all of you, everybody who spoke at workshops and throughout the sessions. I think the conference was a conference of multiplicity. In my experience as an activist now located inside an academic institution, there's not that many experiences I've had in 2 years here at Columbia where there's this many activists and academics in the same room talking, and I want to thank each of those people, and some of you are both, and all of you are both, and so, many of you are both. When I say academic, I mean scholars. There's so many different kinds of scholarship in the room right now. Also, it's a conference of people inside and outside the nonprofit infrastructures. And I really appreciate how many people, were so wonderfully critical and yet, conversational, that felt like a dialogue. And I'm really appreciative of that. I learned a lot from a lot of different conversations. And it was a conference that was primarily without the funders. And Sue pointed that out in our little group here. And that's sad to me, but they were absolutely all invited. It wasn't that, and it's okay. The word gets out, the work gets out. And that's what I'm so excited about. How much amazing work is happening in this room among all of you. Thank you for that. That is the most important thing in the world. Thank you.